A man is found dead inside a locked glass conservatory in the Surrey countryside. The doors are bolted from within. The windows are sealed shut. There are no signs of a struggle, no marks upon the body, and no weapon to be found. The local constabulary call it a heart seizure. The family physician confirms it. The coroner agrees. The case is closed before the morning papers are even printed. But 3 weeks later, a young woman in a black travelling cloak arrives at 221B Baker Street, soaked through with rain, and tells Sherlock Holmes that her father did not die of natural causes. She has no proof. She has no theory. She has only one strange detail that no one else seems to find significant. A detail so small that the police dismissed her without a second hearing. But Holmes will hear her out, and by the end of this story, and you will see how a single overlooked thread, pulled hard enough, can unravel a murder that everyone else believed was no murder at all. The adventure of the corpse in the conservatory. It was the second week of November in the year 1889. The autumn had turned bitter early that year, and London lay beneath a yellow fog so thick that the gas lamps along Baker Street looked like drowning suns. I had been with Holmes for the better part of a fortnight, recovering from a chill I had caught while attending a patient in Whitechapel. Holmes himself had been restless. 3 cases had been brought to him in as many days, and he had dismissed each one as beneath his attention. "A jeweller's apprentice with sticky fingers, Watson," he had said, tossing the latest letter into the fire. "A husband suspected of nothing more original than infidelity, and a country squire who has misplaced a prize hound. The criminal class of England has gone soft, and I shall go mad before the month is out." It was at 4:30 in the afternoon, just as the fog began to thicken into something more like dusk, that we heard the bell pull at the front door. Mrs. Hudson came up the stairs a moment later, wearing the careful expression she reserved for visitors of uncertain station. "A young lady to see you, Mr. Holmes. She would not give her name. She says only that her father is dead, and that she has nowhere else to turn." Holmes opened his eyes for the first time that afternoon. "Show her up, Mrs. Hudson, and bring tea. The lady has come a considerable distance, and she is half frozen." She entered with the bearing of someone accustomed to better drawing-rooms than ours. She was tall, dark-haired, and her face had the pale composure of recent grief. "Mr. Holmes," she began, "my name is Eleanor Ashcombe. My father was Dr. Reginald Ashcombe, of Thornfield House in Surrey. He was a botanist of some small repute. 3 weeks ago he was found dead inside his conservatory. The doors were locked from within. The windows had not been opened in months. The police were satisfied that he died of a heart seizure brought on by overwork." She paused. Holmes had not moved. "And you do not believe them," he said quietly. "I do not. But I have nothing to give you. No evidence, no suspect, no theory of how a man might be murdered behind locked glass. I have only one thing, Mr. Holmes, one detail that the constable laughed at when I mentioned it. Tell me." "The orchid, Mr. Holmes, my father's prize specimen. A cattleya he had been cultivating for 7 years. It was meant to bloom that very week. He had written about it in his journal 3 days before his death. He intended to photograph it on the morning he was found." She drew a long, careful breath. "When I entered the conservatory after his body had been removed, the orchid was gone." Holmes was silent for a long moment. "Gone," he repeated. "Not wilted, not destroyed. Gone. Removed. Pot and all. There was a place for it on the central bench. The pot is missing entirely. I asked the gardener. I asked our housekeeper. I asked the constable. Nobody saw anyone enter or leave, and nobody can account for what became of it." "A flower," I said, perhaps too gently. "Miss Ashcombe, forgive me. But a missing flower is a strange foundation upon which to rebuild a verdict of murder." She turned her grey eyes upon me, and there was something in them that silenced any further objection. "Dr. Watson, my father had been at work upon that orchid for 7 years of his life. He had refused offers of £300 for it from collectors in Holland. He kept it under lock and key. He spoke of it the way other men speak of their children. And on the morning he died, somebody took it, from a sealed glass house, without leaving any trace at all. "Watson," Holmes said, without turning, "fetch the Bradshaw. We catch the 7:15 from Waterloo." We took the 7:15 from Waterloo in a compartment that was, mercifully, empty. Miss Ashcombe sat at the window, watching the lights of London thin and vanish behind us. Holmes had said almost nothing since we left Baker Street. He had a way, in the early hours of a case, of withdrawing into himself so completely that he seemed less a companion than a passenger one happened to be travelling beside. It was nearly 9 o'clock when we alighted at the small village station of Thornfield Halt. A trap was waiting for us. Miss Ashcombe had wired ahead, and we were driven through 3 miles of wet lanes to the house itself. Thornfield House was larger than I had expected. 3 stories of pale stone set back from the road behind a stand of ancient elms. The conservatory ran along the east wing, a great construction of iron and glass, perhaps 30 feet long and 20 wide, attached to the main house by a short corridor. The household, as Miss Ashcombe described it on the journey, consisted of herself, her stepmother, Mrs. Margaret Ashcombe, whom Dr. Ashcombe had married only the previous spring, the housekeeper, Mrs. Trent, who had served the family for 20 years, the gardener, old Hobbs, a kitchen maid named Alice, and the doctor's secretary and assistant, a young man named Julian Westcott. "And the doctor's circle of acquaintance, Miss Ashcombe?" Holmes asked as the trap rolled up the drive. "Visitors? Correspondents? Rivals?" "He was a quiet man, Mr. Holmes. He corresponded with botanists in Edinburgh and at Kew. There was one collector, a Mr. Hargreave, who came to dinner some weeks before my father's death. They argued, I am told, about the orchid, in fact. But Mr. Hargreave returned to Holland the following day and was demonstrably abroad when my father died." "Demonstrably," Holmes murmured. "An interesting word. Watson, make a note of Mr. Hargreave." We were greeted at the door by Mrs. Trent, the housekeeper, a stout woman in her late 50s, whose face had the closed, careful expression of long service. She took our coats with a curtsy and led us into a drawing-room where Mrs. Margaret Ashcombe was waiting. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I cannot pretend to understand why my stepdaughter has brought you here, but I will not stand in the way of her grief, however eccentric its expression. The house is at your disposal. You may speak with whomever you wish." Her voice was low and well modulated. Her hands were perfectly still in her lap. There was nothing whatever in her manner that one might have called wrong, and yet, looking at her, I felt the same instinctive unease I had once felt in a poisoner's parlour in Lambeth. Holmes inclined his head with that particular politeness which, in him, always concealed something colder. "You are most accommodating, madam. We shall try not to inconvenience the household. With your permission, we should like to begin with the conservatory itself." "Of course. Mrs. Trent will show you the way, although, I should say, the room has been cleaned. My husband's body lay there for some hours before he was discovered. It would not have done to leave the place as it was." "Cleaned," repeated Holmes, with the same gentle politeness. "How thorough of you." "My husband would have wished it so." We followed Mrs. Trent down a panelled corridor, lined with botanical prints and the heads of small Surrey deer. At the end of the corridor stood a heavy oaken door. The housekeeper drew a key from her chatelaine and unlocked it. "This is where the master was found, sir," she said quietly. "Sat there in his chair by the central bench, as if he had only sat down to think." The conservatory was, even in November, alive. Tropical plants stood in serried ranks along iron staging. A fountain trickled at one end. The air was so heavy with moisture that within a moment my spectacles fogged over. Holmes paused at the central bench. He set down his lamp. He bent very low to the wooden surface. He sniffed. He produced his lens and examined a small patch of soil that had been spilt and not entirely cleaned away. "Watson," he said at last, "come and look at this." I joined him. On the dark wood of the bench, almost invisible against the grain, was a fine ring of dust where a pot had stood. The dust outside the ring was thicker. The dust within was almost absent. The pot was here, Holmes said, and was removed quite recently, within the last day or two, I should say. But Miss Ashcombe said the pot vanished 3 weeks ago. Yes, Watson, said Holmes with a strange little smile. She did say that, did she not? Tell me about the doors, Mrs. Trent, said Holmes without looking up. On the morning Dr. Ashcombe was found, who reached him first? The housekeeper folded her hands before her. She had the manner of someone reciting a story she had told before. It was Hobbs, sir, the gardener. He came round the outside of the conservatory at 7:30, as was his custom, to bring up the morning's coal for the stove. He saw the master through the glass, sat in his chair, and called out to him. When the master did not stir, Hobbs ran round to the corridor door and tried the handle. It would not open. Locked from within. Bolted, sir, from the inside. And then? Hobbs ran for me. I came at once. I had a pass key to the corridor door, but the bolt was thrown on the inside, and no key would turn it. We sent the boy for the constable, and for Dr. Pierce from the village. When Dr. Pierce arrived, we broke the upper pane of the door and reached through and drew back the bolt. Holmes nodded slowly. He stood and crossed to the great glass wall opposite. He examined each window in turn, running his fingers along the lower edges, testing the catches. And these windows? Have not been opened since the cold weather came on, sir. The master was most particular. The orchids would not tolerate a draught. Indeed, they would not. Holmes paused at one window. He bent close. He drew his lens. He examined the catch for a long, silent moment. Watson, observe. I came to his side. The catch was old brass, fastened tight, but upon it, almost invisible, was the faintest scratch, bright against the tarnish, as if something had recently scraped against it and been hastily polished afterwards. Recent, I said. Within a fortnight, perhaps less. And the polish, Watson? The polish itself is suspicious. Why polish a single window catch in a conservatory and not its fellows? He did not speak of it again to Mrs. Trent. He thanked her and asked very mildly if we might examine the rest of the conservatory at our leisure. She nodded and left us, taking her ring of keys with her. The moment her footsteps had retreated down the corridor, Holmes turned to me with a face transfigured. Watson, this is no heart seizure. This is no accident. Dr. Reginald Ashcombe was killed in this room, and somebody took considerable trouble to make us believe he could not have been. But the locked door, Holmes. The bolted door. We have just heard the testimony. The gardener saw him through the glass. The bolt was thrown on the inside. How? Watson, you make the same error which the police make, and which writers of cheap fiction make, and which the murderer fervently desired us to make. You assume that because the door was bolted from the inside when Hobbs arrived at 7:30, the door must have been bolted from the inside throughout the night. It was not. Consider, Watson. We have been told 2 facts. First, that Dr. Ashcombe was found dead in a locked room. Second, that the housekeeper has, this very evening, used the phrase, "the room has been cleaned," in reference to the conservatory. Now, a heart seizure leaves no mess. There is no blood to mop, no struggle to tidy. Why, then, must a conservatory be cleaned at all? What was being removed? I considered. Footprints, perhaps. Dirt brought in from outside. Excellent, Watson. Or soil. Spilt soil from the lifting of a heavy pot. Soil disturbed by someone who entered this room after the doctor's death, removed the orchid, and then left, locking the door behind them. But the bolt, Holmes? The bolt, yes. The bolt is the trick of the thing. Watson, you have seen how this conservatory is built. The corridor door is heavy oak with a brass bolt on the inside. The glass panels above the door are leaded. Can the bolt be reached through the upper pane? It is too high, surely. By a hand? Yes. But by a hooked wire, manipulated by someone who has practiced the motion. That is another question entirely. and we are looking for someone who had time, Watson. Time to study the door. Time to fashion the wire. Time to practice. A member of the household? Necessarily so. He moved to the great central bench and stood once more by the empty patch of dust where the orchid had stood. Now consider the orchid, Watson. Miss Ashcombe tells us it disappeared 3 weeks ago. The dust beneath the pot has been disturbed within the last day or two. Either Miss Ashcombe is mistaken, or somebody has visited this conservatory in the last 48 hours, and has either removed something further, or returned and replaced something they had taken. Why would the murderer return to the scene 3 weeks later? Because, Watson, something has changed. Something has compelled them to come back. We must find out what. Holmes, I said, you said them a moment ago. Do you mean the murderer alone, or do you mean an accomplice? He looked at me with the sharp, hawkish glance I had come to know. Watson, he said, in any household of this size, one murderer is the simple answer. 2 would be very interesting indeed. We did not return to London that night. Miss Ashcombe, with her stepmother's stiff consent, gave us rooms on the upper floor, adjoining chambers at the western end of the corridor, with windows that looked down upon the gravel sweep of the drive. Holmes did not sleep. I heard him pacing his room until past 3. In the morning, over coffee and a kipper neither of us touched, Holmes laid out his plan. We have 4 people to interview today. Watson, Mrs. Margaret Ashcombe, the widow, Hobbs the gardener, Mr. Julian Westcott, the secretary, and Mrs. Trent, the housekeeper. I shall expect each one to lie to me in some particular. Our task is to discover which lies matter. We walked down through the kitchen garden to find Hobbs. He was a man of perhaps 70, weather-darkened and slow-moving, with the unhurried courtesy of countrymen who have outlived 3 generations of their masters. Master Ashcombe were a good man, sirs. Quiet, particular about his plants. Wouldn't let no one but himself touch the orchids. Not even me, and I've been here 40 year. The morning you found him, Mr. Hobbs, said Holmes. Walk me through it, if you would. The old man's eyes drifted past us, into the middle distance. I come up at 7:30, like always. But I had a hod of coal for the conservatory stove. Master liked it kept warm in the night. I come round the south side of the glass, and I seen him sat in his chair. I knocked on the pane. He didn't move, so I run round to the corridor door and tried it. Locked. I called for Mrs. Trent, the rest you know. And the orchid, Mr. Hobbs. Did you note whether it stood in its place that morning? The old man's eyes flickered. It was the briefest of pauses. But Holmes beside me became very still. I could not say, sir. I was looking at the master, not at the flowers. Of course, said Holmes pleasantly. A foolish question. Tell me, did Dr. Ashcombe have any visitors in the last week of his life? Any callers at the conservatory, perhaps after dark? No, sir. Nobody as I seen. And on the night of his death? You did not, perhaps. I've glanced towards the glasshouse from your cottage window before you went to bed. Another pause, slightly longer this time. I went to bed at 9, sir. I did not look out. We took our leave of him. As we walked back up through the kitchen garden, Holmes said quietly, he saw something, Watson, from his cottage window, on the night Dr. Ashcombe died, and he has resolved not to tell us what. Out of fear? Out of loyalty, more likely. Hobbs has been here 40 years. He served the late doctor's father before him. He will not casually betray any member of the family, even the one who killed his master. We must come at him sideways. Julian Westcott had been Dr. Ashcombe's secretary and research assistant for 2.5 years. He had come down from Cambridge with a degree in botany, and what Miss Ashcombe described as more brain than means. He lived in the house, took his meals with the family, and had been treated, by all accounts, almost as a son. He greeted us with the unsteady politeness of a man who had not been sleeping well. "Mr. Holmes, I have been expecting you. Eleanor told me she had gone to London. I cannot tell you how grateful I am that you have come." "You believe, then, that Dr. Ashcombe was murdered?" I believe I do not understand how he died. He was in the soundest health I had ever known him. He had eaten a hearty supper. He had announced that he intended to spend the evening in the conservatory. He told me that the cattleya would bloom that very night, and that he meant to sit up and watch it open. "And did you accompany him?" "No, sir. He preferred to be alone with the orchid. He said it was a private moment for any botanist. I left him at 9:30. I went to my room. I read until 11, perhaps 9:30. Then I slept." Holmes studied him for a long moment. "Mr. Westcott, forgive my asking, but what was your relation to Mrs. Margaret Ashcombe?" The young man's colour rose at once. "She was my employer's wife, Mr. Holmes." "I am aware of that. I asked of your relation to her." "Cordial, sir, as one would expect." "And before her marriage to the doctor, you knew her then?" A pause. "Slightly. We had moved in some of the same circles in Cambridge. She was the widow of a college fellow when I knew her there. She came to Surrey to give a lecture on plant physiology in the spring of '88, and met Dr. Ashcombe through me." "You introduced them," said Holmes. "Not a question." "I did." "Thank you, Mr. Westcott. You have been most helpful." If Westcott had been unsteady, Mrs. Margaret Ashcombe was the opposite. She received us with the composure of a queen who suspects she is being audited, and intends to leave no document unsigned. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I trust you have found the household cooperative." "Most cooperative, madam. I have one or two small questions, if you will permit them." "I will permit anything that brings my husband's killer to justice." She said it without the slightest flutter. "Though I confess I do not believe there was a killer at all. Reginald was 61. He was working too hard. His heart gave out. I wish my stepdaughter could accept that." "Of course. I should like, if I may, to ask about the orchid." A pause. The faintest shift in her shoulders. "The cattleya." "The cattleya. I'm told it disappeared from the conservatory on the morning your husband was found. Have you any thought as to where it might have gone?" "I have not. I am not, Mr. Holmes, a woman who pays much attention to flowers. My husband had thousands of plants in that glasshouse. If one of them is missing, I confess it would never have caught my eye." "And on the night before his death, you went to bed at what hour?" 10:30, as is my custom." "You did not look in upon your husband in the conservatory before retiring?" "I did not. He had asked to be left undisturbed. I respected his wishes." "How thoughtful of you, madam." Holmes rose. One last question, if I may. Forgive its impertinence. You inherit, I take it, under the terms of your husband's will?" "I do, Mr. Holmes. The bulk of his estate, although his daughter Eleanor receives a substantial settlement and the use of this house during her lifetime. We are both, if it matters to you, comfortably provided for." "Most generous of him." "Thank you, madam." We bowed ourselves out. Holmes had decided, over a hasty luncheon at the village inn, that we required 2 further pieces of information before we could press any of our suspects. The first was a matter of pharmacology. The second was a matter of correspondence. "Watson," he said as we walked, "Dr. Ashcombe's body was viewed by the village doctor and pronounced to have died of a heart seizure. No post-mortem was performed, no analysis of the stomach contents. The body has by now been buried these 3 weeks. An exhumation would require a magistrate's order, which we are in no position to obtain. We are therefore obliged to investigate the death without the body." "Then how?" "By examining what was available to the murderer. If poison was used, and I believe it was, it must have been administered through something the doctor consumed within hours of his death. Food, drink, or medicine. Mrs. Trent prepared the supper that evening, and it was eaten by the entire family without incident. Therefore food may be set aside. Drink, possible but unlikely, as the decanters are kept in the dining room and were used by all. That leaves medicine. And here, Watson, we may have something." He stopped before the chemist's shop and pushed open the door. A small bell tinkled overhead. The chemist, ye a Mr. Pettigrew, recognised the Ashcombe name at once. A sad business, gentlemen. Dr. Ashcombe was a regular customer of mine. I made up several preparations for him over the years. "Such as," said Holmes. "A digestive tonic, mostly. A mild bitters of his own formula. He had me prepare it in batches of 12 bottles every quarter." "Did he take any other regular preparation?" "A sleeping draught, sir. Nothing remarkable. Tincture of chloral, in moderate dose. He suffered with insomnia in his later years, especially when working on a particular plant. Mrs. Ashcombe came in to collect the most recent batch." "Mrs. Ashcombe collected it? When?" "Let me see. 3 weeks before her husband's death, perhaps a little more. She said he was working late and could not spare the journey himself." "Was that customary?" "For her to collect his prescriptions?" "It was not, sir. Dr. Ashcombe always came in person. But she explained that he was at a delicate stage with his orchid and could not leave it. I thought nothing of it at the time." "Mr. Pettigrew, a delicate question. If the tincture in that bottle had been augmented by another substance, a substance which mimicked the symptoms of cardiac arrest, would such a substance be obtainable in this village?" The chemist paled. "Not from me, sir. Not from any reputable establishment. But a botanist's household, sir. A man who collected exotic plants. He himself would have access to alkaloids that could not be procured here." "Such as?" "Aconitine, sir, from monkshood. Strophanthine, from the African vine. Or, and forgive me for naming it, the extract of certain South American orchids, which was a study in some scientific journals not 5 years ago." Holmes drew a long, slow breath. He thanked the chemist and walked out into the cold air. "Watson," he said softly, "the murderer used the doctor's own knowledge against him, the doctor's own laboratory, the doctor's own collection. There is in this case a particular cruelty I begin to find very interesting indeed." Holmes had asked Miss Ashcombe whether her father kept any private correspondence which had not been examined by the police. She produced from a locked drawer in his desk a leather portfolio of letters. "The constable looked through these, Mr. Holmes. He said there was nothing of interest. Bills, botanical letters, a few from old friends. With your permission." He turned the letters over with the careful, practised fingers of a man who has searched 10,000 desks. He paused. He drew one letter out. It was on heavy cream paper. The handwriting was small, sloping and feminine. "This one," said Holmes. "Miss Ashcombe. Do you recognise this hand?" She bent over it. Her face changed. "I do not. It is not my mother's writing, not Mrs. Trent's, not anyone in this household." "Read it aloud, Watson." I read. "My dear Reginald, I cannot tell you what relief your letter brought me. After all these years of silence, to know that you have not forgotten, and that you are willing to receive me as I once was, is a gift beyond measure. I shall come to Surrey on the 17th, as you suggest. I shall stay at the Crown in the village. Please, my dearest, tell no one, not even your daughter, especially not her. The fewer who know I am alive, the safer for all concerned. Your own C." "The 17th," she whispered. "He died on the night of the 17th. Holmes set the letter down. "Miss Ashcombe, forgive me. I must ask you something which may cause you pain. Your mother, your natural mother, when did she die?" "When I was 9 years old, 18 years ago, of consumption in Italy." "Were you present at her death?" "No. She had been ill for some time. My father had sent her abroad for the climate. He travelled to her when the end was near. He returned with her ashes and a death certificate from the priest of the village where she died." "Miss Ashcombe," he said gently, "I have very little to tell you yet that is certain, but I think you should prepare yourself for the possibility that your mother did not die in Italy. and that someone in this household has known it for a long time. We had taken rooms at the Crown for that second night. Miss Ashcombe had begged us to stay at Thornfield, but Holmes had wanted, for reasons he did not yet share, to be away from the house after dark. The landlord, a stout man named Bingham, had been most willing to talk once a half-crown had crossed the bar. Holmes asked him if he remembered 3 weeks before a guest who might have stayed at the inn under unusual circumstances. A lady, sir, travelling alone, stayed 3 nights. Her name? Wrote in the book as Mrs. Carter, sir, but, between us, I don't believe it was her name. Why not? Because, sir, the night the master of Thornfield died, she was here, came down to dinner, sat in the snug all evening, where she could see the road. And then, sir, when the news come through the village in the morning that the doctor were dead, she paid her bill in cash and was gone before the noon coach, left no forwarding address. Made me uneasy, sir, but it weren't my place. Describe her if you can. Tall, sir, dark hair gone partly silver, 45, perhaps 50, spoke like a lady, coughed terrible. I thought she might have the consumption, sir, by the sound of it. She had been ill then, long ill. Years by the sound of her, sir. And tell me, Mr. Bingham, did she receive any visitors at the inn during her stay? One, sir. Late, on the second evening, a man came in by the side door, hooded coat. They spoke in her parlour for half an hour. He went out again before 9. I did not see his face. Could you describe him at all? Height, build, anything? Tall, sir, slim. Walked with a younger man's step. We went up to our rooms a little before 11. Holmes did not undress. He sat at the window, smoking pipe after pipe, watching the village square. The fog rolled in thicker as the night deepened. I must have fallen asleep in my chair. When I woke, it was past 2 in the morning, and Holmes was standing at my elbow. Watson, get up. Quietly. 2 of them, Holmes. Hush. Watch. Holmes. That was... Yes, Watson. The young man was Westcott. I was almost sure I would see him here tonight. And the cloaked figure? A woman. You saw the way she moved. Slighter than Mrs. Ashcombe. Younger than the lady at the inn. I confess I am not yet certain. But I have a theory which is beginning to ripen. Watson, tomorrow morning we shall return to Thornfield. We shall ask 1 or 2 further questions. And we shall, I believe, set a small trap. Sleep well. The end of this affair is closer than you imagine. He sat back down at the window, lit a fresh pipe, and did not move again all night. So far we have collected the following facts. A man dies in a locked glasshouse. His most prized orchid disappears. His widow has collected his sleeping medicine 3 weeks before his death. His secretary, who introduced the widow to him, met a strange woman at the village inn on the night of the murder. A letter signed only C has been found in his desk, written in a hand that nobody at Thornfield recognises, suggesting that somebody believed long dead is in fact alive. And now, at 2 in the morning, in the village square, the secretary has met a second woman whose identity we do not yet know. But Holmes has noticed something else, something we have not yet been told, something he saw in the conservatory on our first visit, and which he has not, throughout the second day of our investigation, mentioned to anyone. You may, by now, have seen it yourself. There was, after all, a clue planted in the very first chapter, and another, more obvious, later on. If you saw them, well done. If not, keep watching. Holmes will name them in their proper time. Watson, I shall require your assistance in the small piece of theatre I now propose. You must not, on any account, betray surprise at anything I say. Whatever I propose, agree to it. Whatever I assert, support it. The point is to provoke a reaction. The reaction will tell us what we need to know. What do you propose, Holmes? I propose to announce that I have solved the case, and to name a suspect. The wrong suspect. We shall then watch the household and see whose face changes when the wrong suspect is named. And if no one's face changes, Then I shall have learned something else. Either way, we win. Come, Watson, the curtain rises. We were shown into the drawing room. Mrs. Trent assembled the household at Holmes's request. Within 10 minutes, Mrs. Margaret Ashcombe, Eleanor Ashcombe, Mr. Julian Westcott, Mrs. Trent the housekeeper, Hobbs the gardener, and Alice the maid were all standing in a stiff half-circle before the fireplace. Holmes addressed them with grave courtesy. "I owe you, ladies and gentlemen, an apology. I have intruded upon your grief. I have asked impertinent questions. I have taken up your hospitality. But I am pleased to inform you that my investigation has concluded, and I shall depart for London on the afternoon train." A small ripple passed through the room. Mrs. Ashcombe drew a slow breath. Westcott's hand went to his collar. "I have determined," Holmes continued, "that Dr. Reginald Ashcombe was indeed the victim of a foul deed. He was poisoned on the night of the 17th of October by a substance introduced into his medicine. The murderer entered the conservatory before the bolt was thrown, administered the dose, and left. The bolting of the door from outside by means of a wire through the upper pane was a stratagem, designed, I confess, with some ingenuity, to suggest a locked-room mystery where none in fact existed." "And the murderer," said Holmes, "is Mr. Julian Westcott." "Mr. Holmes," said Westcott, his voice hoarse, I did not. I swear before God, I did not poison him." Holmes turned a wintry smile upon him. "Of course you did not, Mr. Westcott. Pray sit down. You are about to faint, and I do not wish to be obliged to catch you." The household stared at him. "Mr. Holmes," said Mrs. Ashcombe, and her voice for the first time was unsteady. What are you saying?" "I am saying, madam, that I have just performed a small experiment. I named a man whom I knew to be innocent of the murder, in order to observe which face in this room betrayed the most interesting reaction. And I have my answer. Miss Ashcombe, I think you and I should now have a private conversation." "Of course, Mr. Holmes." "As you wish." "Miss Ashcombe," said Holmes quietly, "I shall not waste your time nor my own by pretending I do not understand what I have just seen. When I named Mr. Westcott as the murderer, you did not look surprised. You did not look horrified. You did not look at your stepmother to see whether she had been spared. You looked only at Mr. Westcott, and your face did not change. There is only one explanation. You knew that Mr. Westcott was not the murderer, and you did not protest, because you did not wish me to think too hard about the question. Mr. Holmes, I came to you of my own free will. I asked you to investigate my father's death. Why would I do that if I were the murderer? I have not said that you are the murderer. I have said that you know who is. There is a great difference." A long silence. "Mr. Holmes, may I ask you a question?" "You may." "If you were a young woman of 27 and you had loved a man for 3 years, and that man was about to be ruined by the woman whom your father had foolishly married, what would you do?" "I should ask," said Holmes gently, "what ruined meant. Disinherited, driven from the house, falsely accused. Mr. Holmes, I will tell you everything, but not yet. There is one more piece of the truth which I do not yet have, and without it, anything I tell you will be incomplete, and may do an injustice to a person who does not deserve it. Will you grant me until tonight?" Holmes considered her. Then he nodded. "Until midnight. If you have not come to me by midnight, Miss Ashcombe, I shall act upon what I already know. Thank you." She rose, inclined her head with great dignity, and left the room. "Holmes," I said, "what has just happened?" "I do not yet know everything, Watson, but I know this. The woman at the inn. The woman signing herself C. was Eleanor Ashcombe's mother. We did not idle that afternoon. Holmes had work to do, and he set me to 2 tasks. The first was to send a wire to Inspector Lestrade in London with a careful set of questions. The second was to walk down to the gardener's cottage and speak to Hobbs alone, without Holmes, without any witness from the family, and ask him 3 questions. The questions were these. 1. Did you, on the night of the 17th of October, see any person enter or leave the conservatory? 2. Did you, before the doctor's death, ever see Miss Eleanor Ashcombe in the company of a woman not of this household? A tall woman, dark-haired, with a cough? 3. Did you carry the orchid pot from the conservatory yourself for any person, on any pretext, at any time? I went to him alone, and I sat with him for half an hour while he turned the questions over with the slow, painful honesty of an old man who has been carrying his silence too long. I will tell you, sir, he said at last. I will tell you because I should have told someone weeks ago, and the silence of it has been a heavier weight than I knew how to carry. He told me 3 things. First, that on the night of the 17th, he had risen at 1:30 to relieve himself, and had seen from his cottage window a single figure crossing the lawn from the conservatory. The figure was slight. The figure had been wrapped in a hooded cloak. He had not seen the face, but the figure had walked with the particular gait of a young woman, and Hobbs had known, in his old bones, that it was Miss Eleanor. Second, that 2 months before the doctor's death, and he had seen Miss Eleanor in the lane below the village, in earnest conversation with a tall, dark-haired lady who had coughed badly and had worn a heavy black veil. He had not approached. He had thought it was none of his business. He had seen them meet 4 or 5 times, always in the same lane, always at dusk. Third, that on the morning after the doctor's death, before the constable arrived, Miss Eleanor had come to him in tears and asked him to do her a favour she would never forget. She had asked him to carry a heavy clay pot, wrapped in sacking, from the conservatory to a hollow tree at the bottom of the orchard, and to leave it there. She had said her father had wanted it to be given to a friend, and that if the police thought the pot had been stolen, it would be easier than explaining to her stepmother. Hobbs had loved Eleanor since she was a child of 7. He had done what she asked. He had not asked questions. When we reached the hollow tree, Holmes knelt and reached inside. He drew out a heavy clay pot, still wrapped in sacking, the soil within damp but not frozen. The plant within it was a dark, leathery-leaved orchid, 3 weeks past its bloom. But the spike of the flower, withered now, was unmistakable. "The Cattleya," said Holmes softly. "She did not steal it for its monetary value. She stole it for what it represented. Watson, observe." "What is it, Holmes?" "A key, Watson, to a lock smaller than any door. Probably a writing case, possibly a desk drawer. I think we may have found, at last, the box in which the doctor kept his most private documents. And the daughter, knowing what she would find inside, wished to be the first and the only person to read them." We walked back to the house. The sun was setting, the fog beginning to roll in again across the lawns. Hobbs returned to his cottage. Holmes paused at the threshold of the conservatory and looked once more slowly at the great empty bench where the orchid had stood. "Watson," he said, "I shall now tell you what I believe happened. Stop me if you find a flaw in the reasoning. Years ago, more than 18 I should say, Dr. Reginald Ashcombe sent his first wife, Catherine, abroad for her health. She was tubercular. He did not expect her to live. A few months later, he received word that she had died in Italy. He returned with what he believed to be her ashes and a death certificate from the priest of the village. But she did not die, Watson. She recovered, slowly and partially. Whether she sent word to him and the word was lost, whether someone interfered with her letters, whether she chose, for reasons of her own, to remain dead to him, we do not yet know. Either way, she lived. For 18 years, she lived. In Italy first, perhaps, then elsewhere. And in those 18 years her husband, believing her dead, raised their daughter alone, mourned her, and at last spring, remarried. This past autumn, for reasons we may never fully understand, Catherine Ashcombe wrote to her husband. Perhaps she was dying again. Perhaps she had only that summer learned that he had remarried. Perhaps her daughter, for they had been in correspondence for some time, Watson, of that I am now certain, had finally pressed her to come forward. Whatever the reason, she wrote. He answered. They arranged that she should come to Surrey, stay at the village inn, and meet her husband and daughter again after 18 years. And someone in this household, I said, did not wish that meeting to take place, or wished it to take place precisely once, and then never again. Yes, Watson, now. Who in this household had the most to lose if Catherine Ashcombe returned from the dead? I considered. The new wife, Mrs. Margaret Ashcombe. If the first marriage was never legally dissolved by death, if Catherine were still living, then Margaret's marriage was bigamous. She was no wife at all. She would inherit nothing. She would be ruined. Precisely, Watson. And so, by every principle of probability and motive, the murderer should be Margaret Ashcombe. The reasoning is obvious. The motive is overwhelming. The new wife killed the doctor before he could acknowledge his first wife and disinherit her. He paused. But that, Watson, and this is where the case becomes interesting, is not what happened. It was nearing 11 o'clock. The fog had thickened to a wall of white. The conservatory itself was warm and damp, the orchids and palms throwing strange shadows upon the great glass roof. Eleanor Ashcombe had, true to her word, come to Holmes shortly after dinner. They had spoken in the study for almost an hour. When at last they emerged, Eleanor's face was very pale but very calm, and Holmes had asked the entire household, and Hobbs, to assemble in the conservatory at 11. He now stood, as I have described, at the central bench. The empty pot, for Hobbs had retrieved it from the orchard at his instruction, stood upon the wood. The withered orchid lay across it. The little brass key sat upon the bench beside the pot. Ladies and gentlemen, I have come to the conclusion of my investigation. I shall not labour the matter, but I owe you the truth, and I owe Dr. Ashcombe the dignity of having his death properly understood. Dr. Reginald Ashcombe was poisoned. The poison was strophanthin, almost certainly drawn from his own collection. It was introduced into his sleeping tincture, which had been collected from the village chemist 3 weeks before his death by a member of this household. The dose was not immediately fatal. It mimicked very closely the symptoms of cardiac arrest, which is why the village doctor, without performing a proper post-mortem, took the death for natural causes. The murderer entered the conservatory before the doctor took his nightly tincture. Whether by invitation or by stealth, I cannot say. The murderer ensured that he drank the prepared dose. The murderer left. The bolt of the door was then secured from outside by means of a hooked wire manipulated through the upper pane. Hours later, when Dr. Ashcombe was past saving, the murderer returned. They removed the orchid, the cattleya which the doctor had loved, and they hid it. Why? I shall come to that in a moment. The motive, you might suppose, is obvious. Dr. Ashcombe had received a letter from his first wife, whom he had believed dead for 18 years. She was alive. She was coming to Surrey. If she came forward, his second marriage would be exposed as bigamous. His new wife would be no wife. She would inherit nothing. She would be cast out. And so, you might suppose, the new wife killed him before the meeting could take place. It is a tidy theory. It satisfies the obvious appetites of the case. But it is wrong. Mrs. Margaret Ashcombe did not kill her husband. She did not even know about the letter. She knew, or suspected, that the marriage was unhappy. She knew she had been brought to this house under a degree of false pretense, that her husband had married her too quickly, perhaps for the wrong reasons. She had begun, even before the murder, to fear that she had made a mistake. But she did not know about Catherine. She did not poison the tincture. She did not enter the conservatory on the night of the 17th, and she did not remove the orchid. Miss Ashcombe, would you care to take up the narrative from here? Yes, Mr. Holmes. I will tell it. She turned to face the others. My mother did not die in Italy. She has been alive, all my life, somewhere in Europe. My father knew. He has known almost from the beginning. He went to Italy when she fell ill, yes. But she did not die. She begged him to let her live in seclusion. She did not wish to be a burden. She did not wish me to grow up watching her wither. He agreed. He paid for her care. He never told a soul. He told me last winter. He told me everything. He said it had been the great cruelty of his life, that he had married my stepmother in haste, under the conviction that my mother had at last truly died of an illness she had relapsed into. He had received word that summer, he believed, of her actual death. He had grieved a second time. He had remarried. And then, 3 months after the wedding, he had received a letter from my mother, alive in Switzerland, the previous letter of her death having been sent in error, or perhaps in malice, by someone she could not identify. He told me. He did not tell my stepmother. He intended last autumn to bring my mother home, to have his second marriage annulled, to set my stepmother up with a settlement, generous but final, and to live out his last years with the woman he had loved first. And he told me, this is what I must explain to you, Mr. Holmes. He told me that I would be required to give up everything, that the house would not be mine, but would pass to my mother, that my stepmother would be given a settlement that would consume the greater part of the estate, that the new arrangement would leave me with very little. He told me, and I shall remember the words to my dying day, that he hoped I would understand that the truth was more important than my comfort. And I did, Mr. Holmes. I did understand. I love my mother. I have loved her in secret, since I was old enough to read the letters Hobbs used to bring me from the village post office without my father's knowledge. I corresponded with her for 10 years. I never told my father I knew she was alive. He did not know until last winter that I knew. We discovered each other's secrets at the same hour by the same fire, and we wept together. I would have given up the house. I would have given up everything. To have my mother come home, Mr. Holmes, I would have lived on a kitchen maid's wages. But you did not kill him for the inheritance, Miss Ashcombe. I did not, Mr. Holmes. Why? Then? Because, Mr. Holmes, 2 weeks before his death my father changed his mind. He had a long conversation with my stepmother. I do not know what was said. I know only that afterwards he came to me and told me very gently that he had reconsidered, that he had decided to leave matters as they were, that he would write to my mother and tell her she could not come, that she would receive a continued allowance in Switzerland until her death, but that she could not come home, that his new marriage would stand, that his new wife would inherit, and that I and my mother must reconcile ourselves to the loss. He chose her, Mr. Holmes. He chose his new wife over my mother. After 18 years of grieving, after 10 years of secret correspondence, after everything, he chose the wrong woman because he was lonely, and because he was tired, and because he could not bear the scandal. And my mother had already booked her passage. She was already coming, and when she came, when she stood at our door, he would have turned her away. She drew herself up, suddenly steady, suddenly terribly calm. I could not let him do it, Mr. Holmes. I could not let him break her heart a third time. Miss Ashcombe, said Holmes very quietly, I shall ask you to confirm what I now believe to be true. You administered the dose to your father's tincture on the morning of the 17th. You came to him in the conservatory at 9:30 that evening, when he was alone with his orchid. You shared a glass of port with him, in which the dose had already taken effect. You watched him grow drowsy. You waited. You confirmed that he was dead. You left. You returned at 1:30 in the morning, by the corridor door, and you removed the orchid, because you knew that within its pot, in the soil, your father had hidden the small brass key to his writing case. The writing case contained the letters from your mother, which would have proved her existence to anyone who searched for them. You took the orchid and the key, you hid them in the hollow oak, you bolted the corridor door from the outside with a wire prepared in advance, and you returned to your bed. The bolt was discovered in the morning. The death was assumed natural, and only one person in the household, Hobbs, who had risen in the night, saw you cross the lawn. He has loved you since you were a child. He has said nothing. That is what I did. And the second window catch, Miss Ashcombe, the one which had been polished, that was done not on the night of the murder, but a week before it. While you practiced. I practiced, yes. I had to be sure the wire would hold the bolt. And the orchid pot in the conservatory. The dust beneath it had been disturbed within the last 48 hours. You returned, did you not, on the day before our arrival, to check that the key was still hidden in the soil? I did. I'd heard from Mr. Westcott that an investigator had been engaged. I needed to be sure. And Mr. Westcott. Mr. Westcott loved me, Mr. Holmes. He has loved me for 2 years. He met my mother once with me in the lane below the village. He knew about the correspondence. He knew about my father's plan and the change of plan. He knew, though he never asked me directly, that I might do something terrible. He has not been my accomplice. He has been my silent witness. He met my mother at the inn on the night of the 17th to tell her what had happened, to beg her not to come up to the house, to beg her to leave Surrey before the body was found, because he feared, as I had feared, that if she were seen, she would be blamed. She has lung disease, Mr. Holmes. She is not a strong woman. She could not have endured a murder inquiry. Last night in the village, said Holmes, he met her to warn her, to tell her I was here, to beg her once more to leave. Yes. And the cloaked woman in the square last night, Mr. Westcott, that was Catherine Ashcombe. It was, sir. And she has now left Surrey. By the night train. She is by now on the boat for Calais. She will not return. Holmes was silent for a long time. He looked at Eleanor Ashcombe. He looked at the withered orchid on the bench. He looked at the great glass walls of the conservatory, white with fog now, silvered with frost. Miss Ashcombe, he said at last, I am not the law. I am only its servant. And in this case, for the first time in many years, I find that the law and my own judgment are not in perfect alignment. You will not arrest me? That, Miss Ashcombe, is for the law to decide. I will tell Inspector Lestrade what I know. He will pursue the matter as he sees fit. I shall not, however, recommend any course to him. I shall lay the evidence before him and let him judge. But I shall tell you this. You have done a terrible thing. The fact that your father did a cruel thing first does not undo it. He chose badly, but he was an old, lonely, frightened man, and his cruelty was that of a coward. I'm not a monster. You took his life. You will carry that for the rest of your own. I will not add to your burden by manufacturing a punishment. The world will deliver one quite sufficient on its own. We took the morning train back to London. The fog had lifted at last, and the Surrey fields lay pale and stubbled under a white winter sun. Holmes had not spoken since we left Thornfield Halt. Holmes, I said at last, what will Lestrade do? He stirred. He drew his pipe from his pocket and tamped down a fresh fill. He will receive my letter. He will read it twice. He will swear at length in the privacy of his office. He will travel to Surrey. He will interview Miss Ashcombe. He will, I imagine, charge her with murder. And the trial? A trial of considerable public interest. The defence will be that she acted under provocation, that her father's intended cruelty to her mother had unbalanced her. There will be doctors of nervous disease called to testify. The jury, Watson, may be merciful, or they may not. I have, in my career, ceased to predict juries. And her mother? Catherine Ashcombe will, in all likelihood, be summoned to give evidence. Whether she comes, given her health, is another question. If she does not come, a deposition will be taken in Switzerland. And Mr. Westcott? Mr. Westcott did not poison the doctor. Mr. Westcott did not unlock the door. Mr. Westcott did not move the orchid. He did, however, knowingly assist in the concealment of a witness, Catherine Ashcombe, and in keeping silence about a crime he suspected. He will face certain charges, but lesser ones. He will not hang. I considered for a long time. Holmes, once you said something in the conservatory which I should like to hear again. You said that you found in this case that the law and your own judgment were not in perfect alignment. He drew on his pipe. He exhaled slowly. Watson, I have hunted down poisoners, garroters, blackmailers, and a small army of assorted reptiles. I have, in nearly every case, felt the same simple and unshakable certainty. The murderer must be brought to the dock. The dock is the price the murderer pays for the right to live in the company of other men. I have never doubted this principle. I doubt it slightly, Watson, in the case of Eleanor Ashcombe. I doubt it because she did not kill for greed, or for anger, or for the petty jealousies that fill 3/4 of the cases I have ever investigated. She killed because she was about to lose her mother, for the second time, after 18 years of grief. I do not say it justifies what she did. It does not. But I find, for the first time in some years, that I cannot simply dispatch the criminal to her cell and dust off my hands. Something in me hesitates. He paused. Watson, do you think I have grown soft? I think, Holmes, that you have grown human, which is, in your case, a very rare and precious development. He laughed quietly, a single dry exhalation, and turned his face to the window. We did not speak again until London. That evening, in our rooms, Holmes took up his violin for the first time in 3 weeks. He played a slow air I did not recognize, something from his own composing, perhaps. The fire burned low. Outside, the fog rolled in once more upon Baker Street, and the gas lamps shone yellow upon the wet stones. I took up my pen, and I began to write down the affair which I have here laid before you. It is a strange story. It contains no thunderclaps, no gunfights, no chases through the rain. It contains only a man who chose badly, and a daughter who could not bear the cost of his choice, and an old gardener who had loved her since she was a child of 7, and a young secretary who had loved her since the first time he had seen her face. Sherlock Holmes wrote to Inspector Lestrade that evening. The letter arrived at Scotland Yard the following morning. 2 days later, Lestrade travelled down to Surrey with 2 constables, and the arrest of Eleanor Ashcombe was effected without incident. The trial which followed was one of the most discussed of that winter. The defence summoned 3 medical men, Catherine Ashcombe by deposition from Lausanne, and Mr. Julian Westcott as a witness in mitigation. The prosecution summoned Mrs. Margaret Ashcombe and the chemist, Mr. Pettigrew. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. Eleanor Ashcombe was convicted of murder. The judge, in passing sentence, observed that the case was one in which the moral guilt of the prisoner was profoundly mixed, but that the law of England did not permit a daughter to take her father's life, however grievously that father had wronged her mother. He sentenced her to death by hanging. The sentence was, 3 weeks later, commuted by the Home Secretary to penal servitude for life. Catherine Ashcombe died in Switzerland the following spring, never having seen her daughter again. Mrs. Margaret Ashcombe sold Thornfield House and retired to a village in Cornwall, where she lived quietly and never remarried. Julian Westcott was acquitted of the lesser charges against him, took employment with a botanical garden in Edinburgh, and is, as I write, still living, a man of 50, who has never married and never will. Old Hobbs lived another 4 years at Thornfield, tending the gardens for the new owner. He died in his chair by the fire at the age of 74, with a photograph of Eleanor Ashcombe at the age of 9 on the table beside him. The orchid itself, the cattleya which had sat for 7 years in its pot upon the central bench, was retrieved from Holmes's effects after the trial and given by him to the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. It bloomed twice more before it was lost in the unusually severe winter of 1894. If you have enjoyed this account of one of the strangest cases in my friend's long career, the next adventure waits on screen now. It concerns a man who was murdered 3 times, once in Calcutta, once in Brighton, and once at his own funeral. Click it, and we shall meet again in another fog.